I have sat on this bench for 39 years. I have presided over theft cases of every kind, embezzlement, fraud, burglary, the full catalog of ways one human being can take what belongs to another. I have learned over those 39 years that the severity of a theft is not measured by the dollar value of what was taken. It is measured by what that thing meant to the person who lost it and by the betrayal embedded in how it was taken. On a Friday morning in October, I presided over a theft case that involved an object worth by any conventional measure almost nothing, a small wooden box, some metal and ribbon inside it. And as the morning unfolded, I came to understand that what had been stolen from Harold Whitfield was not an object at all. It was the last physical proof of the most important 6 months of a 90-year-old man's life, and it had been taken from him by the one person he trusted to protect it. Harold Whitfield walked into my courtroom that Friday morning, supported by a walker, moving slowly, but with the unmistakable bearing of a man who had once stood at attention in front of people who mattered far more than anyone in this courtroom. He was 90 years old. He wore a navy blazer with a small pin on the lapel, and underneath the blazer, a crisp white shirt, buttoned to the collar, even though no tie was required. He had dressed for this morning the way he had once dressed for inspection, carefully, completely. As a matter of respect for what the occasion deserved, he was helped to his chair by his grandson, a man in his 40s named David Whitfield, who settled his grandfather carefully and then took his own seat just behind him in the gallery, close enough to reach forward if needed, far enough to let his grandfather speak for himself, because David understood, as I would come to understand over the following 2 hours, that allowing Harold Whitfield to speak for himself was not just a courtesy. It was a debt owed to a man who had spent 90 years earning the right to be heard. My name is Judge Judy Shaindlin. This is the story of Harold Whitfield. And this is the letter that ended a career and restored a man's dignity in the same 60 seconds. Harold had enlisted in the United States Army in 1953 at the age of 19. He had served during the final years of the Korean War and had been part of a unit that, in the spring of 1953, had held a position against a sustained enemy assault for 11 hours, under conditions that the official commendation later described, in the careful, understated language of military citations, as extreme and sustained hostile fire. Harold did not talk about those 11 hours often. His grandson told me later, outside the formal proceedings, that in 70 years, Harold had spoken about that day perhaps a dozen times, always briefly, always with the same controlled economy of words, and that what Harold said about it mattered less than what he did not say, which was the larger part of what had happened and what it had cost him to live through it. What Harold had received for those 11 hours, beyond his life and the lives of the 8 men in his unit who survived because of decisions Harold made under fire, that a court-martial board later officially credited with preventing the position from being overrun, was the Silver Star, the 3rd highest decoration for valor in the United States military, awarded for gallantry in action against an armed enemy. Harold Whitfield's Silver Star, along with his Purple Heart for the shrapnel wound he carried in his left shoulder for the rest of his life, along with his Korean Service Medal and his Combat Infantryman badge, had spent the following 71 years in a small wooden box that Harold's father, a carpenter, had built for him the year he came home. The box was simple, pine, sanded smooth, with a small brass hinge, and Harold's initials carved into the lid by his father's own hand. Inside, on a bed of faded blue velvet that Harold's mother had cut from a dress she no longer wore, sat the medals in the order Harold had arranged them the week he returned from Korea and had never rearranged since. The Silver Star in the center, the Purple Heart to its left, the service medals arranged in a careful row beneath. Harold had married 4 years after returning from Korea. His wife, Dorothy, had passed away 11 years earlier after 56 years of marriage. They had raised 3 children, one of whom, Harold's son Michael, David's father, had died of a heart attack at the age of 58, a loss Harold described in the one moment during that morning's proceedings when his composure genuinely wavered, as the only thing in 90 years of living that had ever come close to the 11 hours in Korea. After Dorothy's death, Harold had lived alone in the house they had shared for 53 years, for as long as his body allowed it. 2 years earlier, following a fall that had resulted in a hip fracture, his family had made the difficult decision, with Harold's full participation and agreement, that he needed daily assistance. He had moved into a small assisted living apartment, and the facility had arranged for a part-time home health aide to visit 5 days a week to help with meals, medication, and the daily tasks that had become harder for a 90-year-old man living with the accumulated cost of a long and physically demanding life. The aide assigned to Harold was a woman named Renata Kovac. She had been a certified home health aide for 6 years and had come to the agency with positive references and a clean record. For the first 8 months, by every account, including Harold's own, she had been competent, attentive, and kind. She had remembered his preferences. She had listened to his stories with what appeared to be genuine interest. She had, over those 8 months, earned a degree of trust that Harold, a careful and not naturally trusting man, did not extend easily or quickly. It was that trust that made what happened next so devastating, and it was that trust weaponized and exploited with what the evidence in this case would show was deliberate calculation that brought Harold Whitfield into my courtroom that Friday morning. The defendant in the case was Renata Kovac herself, facing criminal charges of theft from a vulnerable adult, a charge that carries enhanced penalties under state law, specifically because it involves the betrayal of a caretaking relationship. She sat at the defense table with her attorney, a young man named Trevor Mills, who had the slightly strained posture of someone defending a case he privately found difficult to defend with enthusiasm. Renata herself was in her late 30s, dressed in a gray cardigan that seemed deliberately chosen to project unassuming respectability, and she did not look at Harold once during the entire proceeding. Not once. I opened the file. Renata Kovac, you are charged with theft from a vulnerable adult in connection with the disappearance of military decorations belonging to Harold Whitfield, valued for purposes of this charge at $1,200, but representing, according to the victim impact statement on file, an irreplaceable item of profound personal significance. Do you understand the charges against you? Renata's attorney answered for her. Your Honor, my client understands the charges and maintains her innocence. The prosecution's case is circumstantial. There is no direct evidence placing the medals in my client's possession at any point. I looked at the file. Mr. Mills, I am going to want to hear from Mr. Whitfield about the circumstances surrounding the disappearance before I evaluate the strength of the evidence. Mr. Whitfield, can you tell the court when you first noticed the box was missing? Harold's voice, when he spoke, was steady and carried the particular clarity of a man accustomed to giving precise reports, because precision had once been a matter of life and death. He said, Your Honor, I keep that box on the top shelf of my closet, beside a photograph of my wife. I check on it most weeks. Not because I doubt it will be there, because looking at it reminds me of things I want to remember, he continued. On the morning of August 14th, I went to check on it because it would have been Dorothy's birthday, and I wanted to look at the medals and remember the years we had together. The box was not there. I looked through the entire closet. I looked through every room in my apartment. The box was gone. I said, Who had access to your apartment during the period before you noticed it missing? Harold said, Your Honor, very few people. My grandson David, who visits twice a week. The facility maintenance staff, who enter only with prior notice for specific repairs, and Mrs. Kovac, who was in my apartment 5 days a week, often for several hours at a time, often while I was in another room or resting. I turned to the prosecution's evidence. The investigating detective's report indicated that Renata Kovac had, 4 months prior to the theft, listed a similar set of military medals for sale on an online collectibles marketplace under a different name, using a photograph that the prosecution's expert had identified as showing distinctive scratching on the reverse of the silver star, consistent with damage visible in Harold's own photographs of his medals taken years earlier for insurance purposes. I looked at this evidence carefully. I said, Mr. Mills, the prosecution has presented an online listing showing medals matching the specific specific and unusual damage pattern visible in Mr. Whitfield's own insurance photographs, posted under an account that the detective's investigation traced through payment processing records back to an account ultimately linked to your client's home address. How does the defense explain this? Trevor Mills said, "Your Honor, the connection between the listing and my client is circumstantial. The account name does not match my client's name. The payment processing trail, while suggestive, does not constitute direct proof of my client's involvement. I considered this. I said Mr. Mills' circumstantial evidence, when it forms a coherent and consistent pattern, is not weak evidence. It is simply evidence that requires a judge to assess the whole picture rather than a single isolated fact." Continue. But it was at this point in the proceedings that something happened which I had not anticipated, and which by the end of the morning would prove decisive in a way that no piece of forensic evidence could match. Harold Whitfield, sitting quietly with his hands folded over the head of his cane, asked very politely whether he might address the court directly about something other than the missing medals themselves. I told him he could speak freely. He said, "Your Honor, before the medals disappeared, approximately 6 weeks before, I wrote a letter. I am an old man, and I have had a great deal of time, over 90 years, to think about what matters and what does not, and what matters to me most, more than the medals themselves, is the story behind them, because medals without the story are simply metal and ribbon. The story is what makes them mean something." He reached, with some difficulty, into the inside pocket of his navy blazer and withdrew a folded sheet of paper, worn soft at its creases from being folded and unfolded many times. He said, "I wrote this letter for my grandson David, intending to give it to him along with the medals one day, so that when I am gone, he will have not just the objects, but the truth of what they cost." I had not yet given it to him. It was inside the wooden box with the medals. I asked him directly, "Are you telling this court that the letter was inside the box when it disappeared and that you have it now in your hand?" Harold said, "Your Honor, that is exactly what I am telling you. 3 weeks ago, my grandson received an anonymous envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was this letter and nothing else. Not the medals, just the letter. Whoever took the box apparently did not consider the letter to be of any value and discarded it, or perhaps mailed it back, out of some flicker of conscience I cannot account for. I do not know which. I only know that it found its way back to my family, and that I have read it perhaps 30 times since it arrived, and that I would like, with the court's permission, to read it aloud now." I told him he could. I will admit that in 39 years on this bench, I have rarely felt the particular weight that settled over my courtroom in the silence before Harold Whitfield began to read. He unfolded the letter carefully, his hands steady despite their age, and he began. "Dear David, by the time you read this, I expect I will be gone, and you will have these medals in your keeping, and I want you to know what they are and what they are not, because a man should understand what he is holding. The silver star in this box was not given to a hero. I want to say that plainly, because for 70 years people have called me one, and I have let them, out of a kind of tiredness more than agreement. I was 19 years old and very frightened, and on a night in April of 1953, in a position we held for 11 hours against more enemy soldiers than I have ever been able to count accurately even now, I did not act because I was brave. I acted because the alternative, watching the men beside me die while I did nothing, was simply unbearable to me. Bravery, I have come to understand in 90 years of thinking about it, is not the absence of fear. It is doing the necessary thing despite being more afraid than you have ever been in your life. I lost 2 friends that night. Their names were Walter Hennessy and Charles Boudreau, and I have said their names to myself every single day since 1953 because somebody has to remember them, and I am the last man left from that position who still can. I came home with a silver star and a piece of shrapnel in my shoulder that the doctors said was too close to important things to safely remove, and so I have carried it, literally, for 71 years, a small, hard reminder lodged just beneath my skin of the night I did not die when 2 men beside me did. I am telling you this, David, because I want you to understand that this medal is not a trophy. It is a debt. It represents 2 lives that ended so that mine and the lives of 6 other men could continue. Every year of my life since that night, every birthday, every Christmas, every ordinary Tuesday morning with your grandmother, every moment of watching you and your father grow, every single day I have lived since I was 19 years old has been a day that Walter and Charles did not get to live. I have tried, in whatever small ways a man can manage, to live those days well enough to be worth what they cost. When I am gone, I want you to keep this box. Not because the medals are valuable, though I understand some people consider such things valuable in ways I have never fully understood. Keep it because Walter Hennessy and Charles Boudreau deserve to be remembered by someone, and when I am gone, that responsibility will fall to you the same way it fell to me, and I am trusting you with it the way I would trust very few things in this world. I love you, David. I am proud of the man you have become. Take care of your father's family, and take care of Walter and Charles. Their names are the truest part of what is in this box, truer even than the medals themselves. Your grandfather, Harold. Harold folded the letter slowly and placed it in his lap, and for a long moment the courtroom held a silence so complete that I could hear the clock on the far wall marking each second. I looked toward the gallery. David Whitfield had both hands pressed against his face, his shoulders shaking with the particular silent grief of a grown man trying very hard not to weep openly in a public room. Several members of the gallery, strangers to this case until that morning, sat with tears visible on their faces. Even the bailiff, a man I had watched maintain rigid professional composure through testimony involving the worst things human beings do to one another, stood with his jaw tight and his eyes unmistakably wet. I turned my attention to Renata Kovacs. For the entire reading of that letter, she had not lifted her eyes from the defense table. Not once. And in that refusal to look, in that deliberate avoidance of a 90-year-old man reading aloud the names of two boys who died so that he could live, I saw something that no forensic photograph, no payment processing record, no circumstantial chain of evidence could have shown me quite so completely. I said, "Miss Kovacs, please stand." She stood slowly, her attorney rising beside her. I said, "I have spent 39 years on this bench learning to read the truth in a room, and what I have just witnessed tells me everything I need to know about what happened to that box. But I am not going to rule on instinct alone. I am going to rule on the evidence. And the evidence in this case, taken as a whole, the listing with its identifying damage pattern, the payment trail to your residence, and now, critically, the fact that this letter was returned anonymously to this family roughly 4 weeks after the medals went missing, which strongly suggests that whoever held the medals also held the letter and made a choice about what to keep and what to send back. That is not the behavior of an innocent party. That is the behavior of someone confronting, perhaps for the first time, the human cost of what they had done and finding themselves unable to bear keeping the one thing that made that cost undeniable. I find, based on the totality of the evidence before this court, that the prosecution has met its burden. Renata Kovacs, this court finds you guilty of theft from a vulnerable adult. Before sentencing, I want to say something directly to you, Ms. Kovacs, and I want you to look at me while I say it, because you have not been willing to look at Mr. Whitfield this entire morning, and I am not going to allow you the comfort of avoiding this either. You were trusted, I said, with the care of a 90-year-old man who survived 11 hours of combat that killed two of his closest friends, who carried a piece of shrapnel in his body for 71 years as a permanent reminder of what that night cost, and who kept the physical evidence of that sacrifice in a box his own father built him beside a photograph of the wife he loved for 56 years. You were trusted with his safety, his dignity, and his most precious possessions. And you used that trust to take from him the one thing he could never replace, not because you needed to, but because you calculated that an old man with failing memory and no other witnesses would be unlikely to successfully pursue you. You were wrong, and I want the record of this court to reflect not just your guilt, but the magnitude of what guilt like yours represents. There is a particular category of theft that goes beyond property crime into something closer to a violation of the social contract that allows vulnerable people to trust caretakers at all. What you did does not just harm Harold Whitfield. It harms every elderly person in this state who will now find it a little harder to trust the person hired to help them. because people like you exist, and people like you get caught only when, by chance, a kind-hearted stranger in the postal system decides to mail back a letter instead of throwing it away. I am sentencing you to 18 months in state custody, the maximum available for this offense, given the vulnerable adult enhancement. I am also ordering that your home health aide certification be permanently revoked, effective immediately. And I am referring this case to the state licensing board with a formal recommendation that you never again be permitted to hold any position of caretaking responsibility for an elderly or vulnerable person for as long as you live. Your career in this field ends today in this courtroom, and it ends because of the choice you made to take advantage of a man who survived things in 1953 that you and I, sitting in the comfort of this room 70 years later, cannot fully imagine. The medals themselves, recovered 3 days ago by detectives from a pawn shop 40 miles from this city, where Miss Kovach had sold them under a false name for $400, will be returned to Mr. Whitfield by the end of this week. I looked at Harold. Mr. Whitfield, do you have anything you would like to say before we conclude? Harold rose slowly, leaning on his cane, and he said, Your Honor, I would like to say only this. I did not come here today for the medals. I came here for Walter and Charles because somebody took the only physical thing in this world that connected their memory to mine, and I was not prepared to let that happen without saying their names one more time in a room full of people. He paused. I believe I have done that now. Thank you for letting me say it. I told him the medals would be home with him by the end of the week, exactly where they belonged, beside the photograph of his wife on the top shelf of his closet, where a 90-year-old man could check on them whenever he needed to remember that the 11 hours of 1953 had bought him 71 more years of life, and that he had spent every one of those years trying, in whatever ways a man can manage, to live up to the cost. 6 weeks later, I received a letter of my own. It was from David Whitfield. He wrote that his grandfather had hung the wooden box, repaired now, the small brass hinge replaced, in a place of honor in his apartment, where he could see it from his chair. He wrote that Harold had begun, for the first time in 70 years, telling the story more often, not the story of the 11 hours themselves, which he still kept mostly private, but the story of Walter Hennessy and Charles Boudreau, the two boys who never got to grow old, whose names Harold had spoken in a courtroom because somebody finally needed to hear them. David wrote that his grandfather had said something to him the evening the medals came home that he wanted me to know. Harold had said, I always believed the medals were the important thing. I understand now that the important thing was always the chance to say their names out loud one more time to someone who would actually listen. I keep that letter in my desk now, alongside so many others that remind me what this work is actually for. Not the rulings, not the law itself, important as it is, the names, the stories that would otherwise have disappeared into silence, given one more chance in this room to be spoken aloud and properly heard. Walter Hennessy, Charles Boudreau, I did not know them. I will never know them. But because a 90-year-old man stood in my courtroom on a Friday morning in October and read a letter meant for his grandson, I will not forget them either. And neither, I suspect, will anyone who was in that room that day. That is what this bench is for.